For a long time, the term old soul was seen as a compliment. But today, something has changed. If you browse spiritual forums or online discussions, you will notice an unusual reaction. The label old soul no longer sparks pride, it sparks anger. Many young people push back and say, "Don't romanticize my pain. I'm not an old soul. I was just a child forced to grow up too fast." From a psychological standpoint, they are right. But psychology alone only explains half of what's happening. Because under the same traumatic conditions, most people turn toward aggression, addiction, or emotional numbness. Yet a small group does the opposite. They turn inward. They question reality. They develop unusual depth and awareness. So what actually creates an old soul? The truth is uncomfortable. An old soul does not begin with enlightenment. It begins with a fracture. Today, we're not romanticizing pain. We're decoding the mechanism behind the connection between childhood trauma and what people later call an old soul. Let's set mysticism aside and start with biology. Research on sensory processing sensitivity suggests that many people described as old souls are frequently associated with unusually sensitive nervous systems. Imagine a typical nervous system as having a filter. It blocks excess noise, emotional overflow, and environmental chaos, so the brain can rest. But for these individuals, the filter is thin, sometimes almost transparent. They absorb everything. A raised voice between parents. A subtle emotional withdrawal. The unspoken tension in a household. These signals pass directly into the nervous system, without resistance. For a child wired this way, the world is registered early as unsafe, not because it objectively is, but because their system experiences it that way. When the external world becomes overwhelming, the child's survival mechanisms activate. In psychology, this is known as dissociation or the freeze-and-flight response. But since a child cannot physically escape their home, they escape inward. They retreat into the mind. Carl Jung described this as the development of deep introversion, the creation of an inner refuge. Inside this inner world, something crucial shifts. Instead of participating, the child begins to observe. Instead of reacting, they analyze. They study moods, patterns, and behavioral cues to predict danger. The brain is forced to operate at a higher level, not to grow wise, but to survive. What appears as maturity is not wisdom gained, it is vigilance learned. Critics often argue that the term old soul romanticizes suffering. But let's examine this carefully. If a childhood is entirely safe, comfortable, and predictable, is there any need to ask questions like, "Who am I? Why do people suffer? What is the meaning of existence?" Usually, no. When the ego is satisfied, attention remains anchored in the external, material world. From a depth psychology perspective, childhood trauma is not a reward, nor a punishment. It is a condition that can catalyze inner awakening in certain individuals. The fracture of trauma cracks the illusion of safety early. It separates the individual from unconscious identification with social roles. It initiates a sequence: trauma, self-observation, and finally, identity questioning. While many externalize pain and pass it forward, some internalize it, transforming it into understanding rather than harm. An old soul can be understood as the result of a three-stage process. First, a biologically sensitive nervous system, combined with an environment lacking emotional safety. Second, instead of releasing distress outward through aggression, the system compresses that energy inward, fueling awareness and self-observation. And finally, the output, the pressure of trauma does not destroy them. It crystallizes into insight, restraint, and deep empathy. So whether you call it an old soul or a traumatized child, you are often describing the same underlying process, viewed through different lenses. Psychology sees the wound, inner philosophy sees what formed around it. There is no romanticization here. Because self-understanding is rarely born in celebration. It is usually lit in silence, during long, lonely nights when a child wonders why they exist. If you recognize yourself in this story, understand this: your trauma was not a mistake of creation. It may have been the first challenge that shaped how deeply you learn to understand yourself.